Did we also try the full screen? Yes, amazing. It works. It
Perfect.
works good. Okay, I think we can start right now, right on schedule. So for all of those who have been following the event up till now, welcome back. To anybody joining us right now, welcome. We hope you stay uh, till the end, hopefully. Right now, we are gonna have the third and final lecture of the event. It's gonna be a lecture by Dr. Ahlam Sentil. She is a professor at the National School of Agriculture in Meknes, Morocco. Her PhD was focused on pollinator conservation in Moroccan agroecosystems. She has also contributed to the protection of European pollinators as well under several Horizon 2020 projects. And in general, her research is focused on agroecology, pollinator conservation, biodiversity, as well as sustainable crop protection.
Okay, so can I start?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. So, I'm going to share part of my PhD on pollinator conservation in Moroccan agroecosystems. So when I started my PhD and people in my surrounding began asking me about my research topic, so the first things that came to their mind whenever I mentioned that I'm working on pollinators is honeybee, beekeeping, honey. So it was a bit challenging to explain that I'm still working on pollinators and bees, but not necessarily the honeybee. Not because I don't like the species, but because there are more than 20,000 other species worldwide. And most of these species, they are not social, they do not produce honey, they are solitary and they nest either in the ground or in pre existing cavities. So, Morocco hosts a total of 1,043 bee species belonging to six bee families, and 10% of these species are endemic to the country. The Moroccan bee diversity is quite impressive. So, first, because it represents almost half of the bee diversity that exists across the entire European continent. And second, because this checklist of Moroccan bees, it was produced based on historical data with little monitoring conducted. So we should expect more because just between the publication of the initial checklist of bees that was published 5 or 6 years ago in 2020 and the update that was published a few weeks ago, 80 80 additional species were added to the checklist, representing either new records to the country or new species for science. So Morocco hosts also 136 species of butterflies and 150 species of hoverflies. But we mainly recognize the honeybee because it produces honey. But according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, the economic value of crop pollination, the crop pollination in Africa is 100 times higher than the economic value of honey production. And the honeybee, Apis mellifera, does only cover 15% of the pollination service, while the other pollinators, including wild bees, butterflies, hoverflies, wasps, beetles, covers more than 85% of the pollination service. So, in the Moroccan context, and when I started my PhD and also the project in the frame of which I worked, there were two main questions that we needed to address. The first question: why should we safeguard wild pollinators? So we should explain to the farmers, the policymakers, and to the other researchers why should we safeguard wild pollinators? Because if the pollination service can be covered by the honeybee, which is a domesticated species, so we can domesticate as much as we can to cover the demand of pollination. So this is the question, the first question that we needed to address: why we should not rely solely on the honeybee Apis mellifera, and we need to safeguard the biodiversity of wild pollinators. And the second question: how can we promote pollinator biodiversity in Moroccan agroecosystems? So let's start with the first question: why should we safeguard wild pollinators and not rely on a single species? So there are several reasons, and I will share with you some of them. So, first, because the reliance on a single species to provide an essential service like pollination exposes that service to high risks. The honeybee health has become critical. In the recent years, even in Morocco, the population of honeybee colonies has seen a significant decline and loss. And this loss has even affected one of the oldest traditional apiary in the world, the apiary of Inzikri, which I show here in the picture. So, what would be the alternatives if we lose the entire population of honeybee? So, we should have the wild pollinators, but unfortunately, we don't care about them. I cannot deny that the beekeeping sector in Morocco has seen a significant growth in the number of honeybee colonies. But does the available stock of honeybee, not only at the national scale but at the global scale, does the available stock of honeybee covers the global pollination demand for crops? No, not necessarily. And the evidence was provided 4 or 5 years ago, and I will show it here through this graph. So here you can see the evolution of the honeybee pollination demand represented by the blue line. So the honeybee pollination demand rose 2 times higher than the honeybee colony stock, represented by the green line, which resulted in a deficiency in honeybee pollination service capacity. In other words, the available stock of honeybee cannot cover the growing honeybee pollination demand, and we need to safeguard wild pollinators. Second, so the fees of honeybee hive rental continue to increase. For instance, in the United States, they went from $56 in 2000 to $200 in only 15 years. So maybe the fees of honeybee rental in Morocco are still affordable, but not for so long, because the pollinator dependent crops in the country are expanding. So, for other reasons that are related to the morphology of the flowers and also to the abiotic conditions, we cannot rely fully on the services provided by the honeybee because simply it cannot. For the morphological reason, I will share with you the example of one of the staple crops in Morocco, which is the fig tree. So, due to the particular morphology of the flower of this crop cannot be pollinated by honeybee. It is pollinated exclusively by a single species of wasp called Blastophaga psinens. In regard to the abiotic conditions, so as you know, the activity of honeybee is highly influenced. Sorry. So the abiotic conditions. So I was telling you that the activity of honeybee is highly influenced by the abiotic conditions or the weather conditions, temperature, and also precipitation. Sorry, I'm having a cold. So, for instance, in Morocco, the cherry bloom during winter, and the flowering period of the crop is only 2 weeks. And during this period, generally the temperature are very low and the precipitation are very frequent. And these conditions are not optimal for the activity of honeybee. And therefore, the pollination of this crop is mainly covered by two species of bumblebees, Bombus terrestris and Bombus lapidarius, and not the honeybee Apis mellifera. Additionally, diverse pollinator communities include species with different morphological, behavioral, and physiological traits, and thus many aspects in which they can show a functional complementarity. So there are hundreds of examples and papers that illustrate this functional complementarity between pollinator groups. And here I will share with you an example of a spatial complementarity. So the pollinators differ in the place they visit at the landscape scale, the tree scale, and also at the flower scale. So, for instance, in the United States, specifically California, the flower visitors of almond orchards were found to partition niches at the tree scale. So the honeybees were found to be more frequent in the top part of the tree, while the hoverflies were more abundant in the lower part of the tree. Regarding the wild bees, they were evenly distributed throughout the tree. So now imagine that we rely on a single species to provide the pollination service. In this scenario, only the upper part of the tree will be pollinated and not the other sections of the tree. Last but not least, the global warming. So the global warming has the potential to disrupt the interaction between the plant and its pollinators, leading to a potential mismatch, which is a failure to achieve an efficient interaction. So these mismatches can be driven by a change in the flowering period of the plant or the phenology of the pollinators that can be either advanced or delayed, which results in a mismatch between the interaction between the plants and the pollinators. So these two graphs from a study published in 2015, they show the optimal thermal niche of different pollinator groups: other flies, hoverflies, butterflies, beetles, and wild bees. And as you noticed, each pollinator group has its own specific thermal or optimal thermal niche. So, a high pollinator biodiversity will result in a broad thermal niche of the pollination delivery. So if we rely, for instance, or in our agroecosystem, we have only a single group, or we rely or depend on a single group to provide the pollination service, and we have, for instance, a heat wave that kill the entire populations. So unfortunately, the crop cannot be pollinated. But if we have a high biodiversity of pollinators, the heat wave may affect some groups that are sensitive to heat waves, but we will still have some other pollinator groups that will ensure the pollination service of these crops. So I hope that I provided enough reasons for the first question, in which we wanted to know why we cannot rely on a single species to provide the pollination service. Now let's move to the second question, in which we want to know how can we promote pollinator biodiversity in Moroccan agroecosystems. So in Europe, for instance, or in North America, several strategies were developed to support pollinators, including the promotion of seeding, mass flowering crops, trainings. But one of the famous or the most strategies that were widely used is the seeding of wildflowering plants. So indeed, the farmers are paid to dedicate part of their field to seed wildflowering plants. So though this strategy was very efficient in increasing pollinator biodiversity in agricultural lands, but it's driven by funds and subsidies, and that's it's not economically self-sustaining, because if we stop paying the farmers to seed wildflowering strips, the farmers will immediately stop the seeding of these habitat plants. Additionally, as they are driven by funds and subsidies, these kind of approaches cannot be scalable to low and middle income countries such as Morocco. So our government is incapable to deliver some funds to support biodiversity, mainly of this, especially the one of pollinators. So in this context, and to enable low and middle income countries, including Morocco, to contribute to pollinator conservation, the FAP approach was developed, farming with alternative pollinators. So I will explain the FAP approach by presenting the FAP field. So the FAP field is 300 meters square. So in the FAP field, 25% of the field area, the surrounding zone, is dedicated to seed marketable habitat crops or marketable habitat enhancement plants. So if instead of seeding wildflowering plants that will not benefit the farmers, we use crops as habitat plants for pollinators like canola, coriander, sunflower, zucchini, anise, etc. And the main crop occupies the central zone. So these marketable habitat enhancement plants benefit simultaneously the farmers by the sale or the consumption of the yield of the marketable habitat crops, and the beneficial insects, including pollinators, by providing diverse floral resources. So our objectives was first to assess the impact of this approach on pollinators in the agroecosystem, and also check if this approach can enhance pollinator biodiversity inside the main crop. So to address these two questions, we have selected 6 pollinator-dependent crops, 3 crops that are highly dependent to pollinators, and 3 crops that are moderately dependent on pollinators. And our study was conducted in 4 regions, which are representative of the different Moroccan agroecosystems. So we have Kenitra, which is a region with adequate rainfall, Safro, which is a mountainous region, Satat, a semi-arid region characterized by a monoculture of cereals, which are crops that are not dependent on pollinators, and in oasis, Arfoud and Rish, during 2 years, 2018 and 2019. So to assess the impact of the FAP approach, we always compare FAP field with control field. So as you can see, in the FAP field, we have the main crop surrounded by 5 to 8 marketable habitat crops, and the control field is 100% main crop. So the main crop occupies the entire field. So we collected the flower visitors in the 75% zone, which corresponds to the main crop in FAP and control fields. And we collected also the flower visitor visiting the 25% zone, which is the marketable habitat enhancement plants or crops in FAP field and the main crop in control fields. Now let's check the results of our approach or the impact of our approach on the pollinators visiting or present in the agro ecosystem. So as you can see, the FAP approach increased significantly the wild pollinator abundance and also the wild pollinator richness in the FAP field compared to control fields in the 4 regions, Stad, Rashidia, Safro, and Kenitra during 2018 and 2019. But unfortunately, this was not translated or resulted in an increase of pollinator abundance and richness in the main crop. So the pollinator diversity and abundance, I'm sorry. So I was saying that this did not result in increase of pollinator abundance and diversity in the main crop. So we did not have a spillover of pollinators from marketable habitat enhancement plants to the main crop. So the main hypothesis that we had for this result is the time since the establishment of the marketable habitat enhancement plants. So our trials were conducted in 2018 and 2019. And for us, maybe this period was not enough to start seeing a significant spillover of pollinator from the habitat plants to the main crop. So as I've just presented, the FAP approach proved its effectiveness in increasing wild pollinator abundance and richness in the agro ecosystem. But does the FAP approach alone is sufficient to cater all the pollinators present in the agro ecosystem, or the native wild flowering plants are still necessary to support additional pollinators? So to address these questions, we conducted a small trial using 2 crops, faba bean and eggplant. And here we compared wild pollinator abundance and richness between FAP fields, control fields, and the native wild flowering plants that were flowering surrounding our trials. So our results as presented here in this Venn diagram. So the numbers represent the pollinator richness, the number of species that were collected in each treatment. So there were 28 pollinator species that were collected in FAP fields and also in wild flowering plants. And these pollinators require, in addition to the floral resources provided by FAP fields, the floral resources provided by the wild flowering plants. Additionally, 25 pollinator species were only collected on native wild flowering plants. So if we want to safeguard these pollinators in the agro ecosystem, we should not rely solely on the FAP approach, but we should also support and maintain the native wild flowering plants. So the importance of the native wild flowering plants can be supported by pollen analysis Indeed, we analyzed the pollen collected by the pollinators visiting the main crop for two reasons. First, to check if the pollinators visiting the main crop collect also floral resources from the marketable habitat enhancement plant, and to check also if the native wild flowering plants contribute to the diet of pollinators. So the results show that 35% of the pollinators visiting the main crop were also collecting pollen from the marketable habitat enhancement plants, which is a clear evidence of the contribution of the FAB approach not only on pollinator diversity and abundance, but also to the diet of pollinators visiting the main crop. But, unsurprisingly, more than 85% of these pollinators that were visiting the main crop were also collecting pollen from the native wildflowering plants, not only from the main crop and the habitat enhancement plants. So, the FAB approach, the suggested FAB approach, proved its effectiveness as a conservation tool capable to support pollinator diversity and abundance in the agro ecosystem. Nevertheless, the wildflowering plants or the native wildflowering plants are still necessary to support additional pollinator species. So, in the Moroccan context, if the aim is to support crop pollinators, then we can obviously use the FAB approach. But the FAB approach alone is incapable to cater all the pollinators present in the agro ecosystem. And in this case, we should maintain the native wildflowering plants. So, based on a survey that was conducted by my colleague Youssef Ben Sharki, where he asked the farmers if they were willing to seed wild flowering plants. Unfortunately, none of the farmers agreed to seed wildflowering plants in their fields, but most of them agreed to seed marketable habitat enhancement plants because in this case they will benefit both farmers and pollinators. So we cannot ask the farmers to seed wildflowering plants, but we can at least recommend to the farmers or ask the farmers to tolerate the presence of the native wildflowering plants that occur naturally outside the cropping area. For instance, in the field borders, in the and in the road sides. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Shukran. That was a very detailed presentation. We have 4 to 5 minutes, but I mean, it's fine because we're also going to have a 20-minute break after this, so it's fine. We don't really have any questions in the chat right now, but let's have a chat about what we just heard all about. So essentially, we do agree that it's very important to have wildflowers. And yeah, just like I love what you mentioned, just tolerate the ones that are there. I've also heard a lot about, I guess, like in urban areas, what we can do is like in our yards or like even our balconies, we can plant wildflowers. That is one of the best things we can do, right? For like urban pollinator diversity.
So, first, fortunately for Morocco, we still have a lot of wildflowering plants even in urban areas.
Nice.
So, just 2 or 3 years ago, I've published a small paper in which I discovered 3 species new for the country, just in urban areas.
Amazing.
And the second point, I'm not sure, but maybe in Europe or even in North America, you have some seed mixtures of wildflowering plants that are available in the market, which is not the case in Morocco. Maybe you can confirm if you have it or not.
Do we, Davar?
Uh, I have a couple different questions. I started to write my questions, but then it's too hard to explain. The seed mixtures, yeah, we do have seed mixtures. Obviously, Europe is a continent, so we can't. We have some. There's this initiative that where they're trying to make a seed mixture that would be most generalist for most of the European countries, but it's still very hard, and those plants are
Mm-mm.
maybe not best for pollination. But yeah, the system that you mentioned, one of my questions was that obviously the addition of cultivated plants is possible, but the native plants, once they're gone from an area, you can't really seed them because we don't have any seed banks that can
Yeah.
produce something like that. I have a question regarding one of the graphs that you shown. It's a graph of a plant of a tree, and you mentioned that apis pollinates on the top, the wild bees like on the middle of the tree, and syrphids on the bottom, which is amazing. I never really thought about the height difference.
Mhm.
Uh, do you think that is because of the difference in how high they fly, or just the preference of pollinating the flowers on the top of a plant because maybe they're the youngest?
I actually don't know the reason behind this spatial distribution at the tree scale, but it's just admiring how different pollinator groups can partition their niches so that they will not have really a competition. There are also some temporal complementarity in which, for instance, we see that the hoverflies are the first to forage on crops, followed by honeybees, then the wild bees. Uh, but sorry for that, I don't really have an explanation for that.
No, thank you. And basically, the FAP system would kind of entail that if you're going to track so many pollinators on a crop, you should lower the amount of pesticides because now there's going to be much more insects there.
Yes, yes, it was one of the main recommendations that we provided to the farmers to whom we worked with, because during the flowering, if your crop, so for instance, the for orchards like cherry, apple, and almonds, the farmers know very well that their crops are dependent to pollinators for pollination because they rent some honeybee hives, so they don't apply pesticide at least during the flowering period. But for some crops like tomato, eggplant, zucchini, most of these farmers in other regions, they don't know that their crops rely on pollinators for pollination, and unfortunately they can apply pesticides during the flowering period, and this will reduce their yield. So, and they will never know that because of pollinators, they destroyed the entire population of pollinators by applying this pesticide during the flowering period. So to answer your question, there are some farmers that do know that they should not apply pesticide during the flowering period, and others don't know.
Thank you. And I'm not sure, have you mentioned in the presentation, so the FAP system with the addition of cultivated plants, could it be scaled up, or did you try scaling up to some larger level, like a bigger
Yes,
fields and everything?
yes, I can share some studies if you are interested. We assess the impact of the FAP approach also at a larger. So in our case, with the first trials, we assessed the impact of the FAP approach on pollinator-dependent crops. But at a larger scale, we also assess the impact of the FAP approach on pollinator-independent crops like cereals, to assess the impact of the FAP approach on natural enemies, not necessarily pollinators, because cereals do not require pollinators, but to assess their impact on natural enemies of pests. And it was successful as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
If there are no more questions, maybe we should do it's going to be an 18-minute break before the South America panel begins. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, in that case, thank you so much, Dr. Ahlam.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
It was nice to meet you. Okay. See you later.